This video is part 2 of a series which set out to explain the controversy surrounding the removal of Confederate monuments in the United States. These monuments commemorate some aspect of the Confederate States of America, a government which lasted a year less than most car loans, was founded on the basic assumption of white supremacy, and which fought a war to defend slavery. If you haven't seen part 1, you might be thinking, that's a bit harsh, right? Well, that's what I thought too, and not that long ago. But the founders of the CSA said it was about slavery and white supremacy, and who am I to argue with them? If you haven't seen part 1, pause this video and click here to go give it a watch. It'll provide some necessary context. Because today I'm asking how history became heritage. The Civil War ended with the surrender of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia on April 9, 1865. Roughly 800,000 Americans were dead, including civilians, and large parts of the country were in ruins, mostly in the South, as you might expect. But it wasn't just the cities of the South that were shattered. The idea of the proud, honorable Southern culture steeped in military tradition and prowess, not to mention convinced of its own superiority, was basically in shambles. Not only had a bunch of city folk beat them on the battlefield, all their stuff was broken, and they weren't allowed to order black people to fix it for free anymore. Bummer. See, this is the problem with building a cultural identity on a fairy tale. At some point, reality kicks the door down and you're left with two choices. Option 1, deal with it. Face reality, reflect on your choices, take responsibility, and work hard to make changes consistent with learning those lessons, thereby creating value from a difficult experience. Or option 2, say, F that. Don't deal with it. Reflect on why you were right all along. Deny all responsibility. Work hard to justify your previous actions and play the victim, thereby negating the need to make any changes at all. I have to say, option 1 is pretty much the internal equivalent of climbing Mount Everest. Experiencing identity-destroying trauma and then making the choices necessary to forge that trauma into a chapter of meaningful self-improvement, man, yeah, that's hard for anyone to pull off. Never mind everyone, or even most. So maybe it's not really surprising that as a group, the people who identified with the goals of the Confederacy went with option 2. This collective act of delusion had a name, the Lost Cause. What follows is a quick explanation of how the Lost Cause ideology and myth evolved. But first, it might seem like this series is picking on the American South, which it kind of is, but only because that's where this happened, and that's how the people who orchestrated this stuff identified themselves as a culture. What I don't want to do is paint the picture that I'm referring to everyone in the South when I talk about this, or even the majority of the Americans who lived there. In several southern states, the majority of the Americans who lived there were newly freed slaves, and they certainly weren't a diligent group of Confederate apologists. I also don't mean to leave out the countless white supremacists, lost cause promoters, and racists in the rest of the country. The people who, actively or passively, adopted a conciliatory view of the Confederacy, which doomed several generations of Americans to a life of discrimination and racial abuse. We all have points of racism, bias, and ignorance knocking around in our thought processes, which is both a shitty reality and inevitable to some degree. There are obvious differences in impact, but unacknowledged, unconscious, or rationalized passive racism is still a big deal, especially en masse. 1,000 pebbles can block a stream just as easily as one boulder. Worse, even adding one pebble is the opposite of, removing the boulder. But this disclaimer in no way means that the architects of the New South and the Lost Cause were a small but vocal group. Not at all. The focus of this video is partially explained by one of the tenets of the Lost Cause itself, the one that says the North didn't fight the war to end slavery, which is probably a fair statement, all told. Certainly some Union soldiers were staunch abolitionists, but the official goal was to preserve the Union. But we're not talking about Union monuments, and I don't see how a morally murky Union cause somehow justifies the blatantly racist pro-slavery cause of the Confederacy. And that's why this series focuses on the South. A friend of mine put it like this: occasionally, I go running. I've done it, I'll do it again at some point. It's a part of my life right now, if only barely. But I wouldn't call myself a runner. I don't have a marathon coming up, I haven't clocked a lap time since high school, and I don't have one of those spiffy shirts that keeps your nipples from bleeding on 30-mile runs. Sure, I run, but some people are runners. People who actively participate in the running community at large and who have made running a part of their identity. While the I run a 3-hour marathon racists might not have been the majority of a given state's population, it was definitely the majority of several states' white populations. And those states happen to be mostly in the South. If my saying that makes you feel uncomfortable or defensive, why? To be clear, I don't mean to say you shouldn't feel that way, but why you feel that way is one hell of an important question. Maybe you live in the South, maybe you're from there, maybe you have family there, maybe you're white and this is super awkward now, and boy is it ever. But for some of us, it's option 1 or option 2 time, baby. And here's your opportunity for growth. All right, back to it. The term first showed up only a year after the end of the war, in 1866, on a book titled The Lost Cause, a new Southern history of the War of the Confederates. It could be that the author meant to call it The History of the War of the Confederates, but in this case, adding new and Southern to the title doesn't seem like an accident, because this was a new history, not the history, and it was definitely intended to be the Southern version of what happened. The myth of the Lost Cause was born. It would come to have a few major talking points over the next 150 years or so, but here are the major ones. That slavery was not a major reason that the Southern states tried to leave the Union. The myth instead suggests issues of states' rights and economic reasons. It tries to create the idea of the noble Southern way of life by focusing on Confederate heroes like Lee, Jackson, and Forrest. The myth also tries to point out the North's motivation for fighting the war was not to end slavery, but was rather greed. It tries to rejuvenate the image of the common CSA soldier, who, according to the myth, fought for bravery, home, country, honor, and ideals, but not slavery. It portrays the extension of civil rights to newly freed slaves as a giant mistake, one that did more harm than good, and one that was motivated by Northern revenge. It also frames slavery as not just a benevolent institution, but a positive one. Honestly, tracing the Lost Cause ideology has filled volumes of books, both those that shape it and those that track it. But here's a quick rundown of how it evolved. After Edward Pollard published this new history, the movement was shaped by several groups. Confederate General Jubal Early helped to mold the ideology in speeches. Ex-con President Jefferson Davis published another history of the war in 1881, and several other works came out which either ignored the slavery question or characterized the common Confederate soldier as, again, honorable, loyal, and bravely fighting for their home and principles, who lost, but lost heroically against overwhelming odds. By 1900, the Lost Cause had reached its mature form, and this is where we start to see the myth transition from a way to explain the loss of the Civil War in the South into the nationally accepted view of American history. In 1898, the U.S. got itself into the Spanish-American War, the first major U.S. conflict since the Civil War, and a nice excuse to turn the national gaze toward a common enemy. Some of the ideals of the Lost Cause were useful to allow the country to once again become a unified entity. As a way of explaining the loss to the South, the myth took the teeth out of any lingering resentment Southern citizens felt toward their Northern neighbors. It allowed them to make peace with their loss and to replace shame and defeat with ideals of loyalty and sacrifice. And by portraying slavery as a benevolent system, it helped justify the institution of restrictive, segregational, and dehumanizing Jim Crow laws, which we'll get to in a minute. To the north, the best parts of this kindly and honorable Southern culture were seen as invaluable additions to the U.S.'s national identity. It also basically ignored the treatment of black people in the United States, which was rapidly developing into what we now call the Jim Crow era. But it sure was politically expedient at the time. The U.S. as a whole mostly accepted the Lost Cause point of view as either a convenient way to move on or simply because that's what they learned in school. Historian wasn't really an academic profession until nearly the end of the 1800s. So when historians codified the official historical narrative of the Civil War and Reconstruction, they used many of the books written by former members of the Confederacy as their source material. One particular group, though, known as the Dunning School, were much more aggressive in their stance that giving equal rights to black people had been a terrible plan. That was when they mentioned black people at all. The South, or the people, when used in histories produced under the Dunning School, pretty much meant white folks. I should mention, too, that the Dunning School wasn't some fringe element. The Dunning School dominated the historical narrative regarding the post-Civil War South between 1900 and 1930. One of their last disciples, this guy, we'll talk about more in the next episode, but he carried the torch for these ideas all the way into the 1960s. A less academic, but no less influential author, Thomas Dixon Jr., who is described on his Wikipedia page as a professional racist, wrote a series of famous novels around the 1900s as well. These include The Leopard's Spots, A Romance of the White Man's Burden, and The Klansman. These novels were extremely popular. That last one became the basis for a silent film epic, which depicted a race war and justified the actions of the KKK. That film, called The Birth of a Nation, was actually the first film screened at the White House by then-President Woodrow Wilson, a man who had grown up in Virginia absorbing the Lost Cause ideology, who threw a civil rights leader out of the White House, and who brought segregation to D.C. with his administration. A day after the first screening, the film was shown to an audience of 38 senators, the Secretary of the Navy, and the entire Supreme Court. Its popularity directly led to the formation of the Second Klan, which eventually would grow to have over 3 million members nationwide. And that's the Lost Cause myth, the fairy tale that maybe began as a way to help the citizens of the Confederacy grapple with a stunning defeat and unparalleled social upheaval, but definitely became a way to excuse and then to enforce a new society based on segregation, black disenfranchisement, and white supremacy. How we get from one to the other does bear some explanation, though. Where was the pushback to the people who were just making stuff up? Why wasn't this stamped out? After all, the 15th Amendment, the one that allowed black men to vote, was ratified in 1870. And even in 1900, the black population of Mississippi was almost 60% of the total. So how were Dunning School historians allowed to legitimize racist fairy tales when by then black people had controlled half the vote for over 30 years? Well, I think it's time we talk about Jim. At the end of the Civil War, things were understandably a bit awkward. This period directly following the end of the war is what's known as Reconstruction. A whole bunch of civil rights laws were passed to protect the newly freed populations of the former slave states, and they were ostensibly enforced by federal troops who were stationed in the South. This didn't sit so well with a white population that had just tried to form a government based on the literal idea of white supremacy. The myth of the Lost Cause would later portray these Reconstruction protections in the same way that it did the Emancipation Proclamation from 1862, that these were all actions taken by the North to punish the South, and possibly to cause an explosion of retribution, violence, and revenge against former slave owners at the hands of their now freed slaves. Clearly, the white population of the South needed to protect itself. So in full-on Fort Sumter logic, they struck first. The KKK was born the same year that the Civil War ended. It and other paramilitary groups set about terrorizing any black people who tried to vote or who became politically active. These groups, like the White League and the Red Shirts, also attacked anyone running for office, who they felt would further advance non-white interests. There were some successful instances of political organization which helped represent the black population, especially in the rural parts of the South. But these attacks grew in severity to match the meager political successes of the Republican and Fusion parties in the late 1800s, going so far as an actual coup in North Carolina in 1898, in which Democratic Party leaders orchestrated a riot through a black neighborhood, shooting anyone they found, and then which ended with several legitimately elected government officials being forced to resign at gunpoint, so that a white supremacist group could take over. Surprising no one, the main riot organizer became the mayor. Meanwhile, the Redeemers, a conservative group of the Democratic Party controlled by rich business owners. Hold on. Democrats. Okay, no, it says so right there. Weird. Anyway, Democrats. These jackasses had the goal of redeeming the South. States that had been returned to white rule had achieved redemption, and those not yet ruled by white folks were still unredeemed. Basically, when a bunch of white people in the South realized that the U.S. was going to eventually end slavery, they bailed. They tried to start their own government that made it mandatory, and after they got their butts kicked in a war, they had to get crafty. So the guys with the hoods and the guns made sure black people didn't vote and drove out any political groups who might represent them. And, wouldn't you know it, the only ones left were the Redeemers. They got power and immediately started passing laws to enforce white supremacy. The first order of business was to make sure that they stayed in power. So they passed poll taxes and literacy tests as a requirement for voting, thus taking the vote from the vast majority of the black population. I mean, slavery doesn't really leave a lot of time for recreational reading or starting a savings account. So requiring a fee and an exam in order to vote was a pretty efficient way to stop huge numbers of potential black voters from exercising their rights. Also, just to make sure poor, illiterate white folks could still vote, states added laws stating that if you had a family member who had the right to vote in that state before the Civil War, congrats, you were exempt from the fees and the tests. Conveniently, only white people had grandfathers who could vote before the Civil War, and that's where we get the term grandfather clause. So, there's a thing never to say again. By the mid-1870s, white Democrats had enough power over the political apparatus of the South that in 1876 they were able to screw with a presidential election to the point where they forced a compromise. They allowed Rutherford B. Hayes to become president in exchange for the removal of federal troops from the last 4 unredeemed states. These troops were the ones enforcing the civil rights laws, and once they left, the Democrats' political control over the South was completed pretty quickly. In Louisiana, by 1910, 36 of the state's 60 counties had 1 or fewer black people registered to vote, even though black people accounted for more than half of the state's population. Once political control was established in an area, the government began to institute laws mandating a separation between black and white populations. Slavery no longer existed, but these laws tried to retain as much of the pre-Civil War structure of society as they could. This campaign of disenfranchisement and later segregation was codified by what were known as Jim Crow laws. As for Jim Crow, he was a blackface character performed by a white actor in the first third of the 1800s. I'm not going to name the guy, but he basically did a look at the silly black person routine to the song Jump Jim Crow, a song he adapted from the tune of a popular slave song. That guy's routine was insanely popular, like went on international tour popular. And Jim Crow became a pejorative word for black people in the South, because stealing the song wasn't enough, apparently. Skip ahead to the late 1800s, and those segregationalist laws passed by the now unchallenged Southern Democrats became known as Jim Crow laws. And that's how the myth of the lost cause went mainstream, with only the barest peep of opposition, which was, of course, ignored. And just like Redeemer Democrats, those folks tending to the lost cause myth used its position of authority to turn right back around and solidify its power, to make sure things stayed that way. In episode 3, we'll talk about how the myth of the lost cause was instituted into the curriculum in Southern schools. And finally, we'll talk about the monuments. Thanks again for joining me, as always. If you learned anything, if you think I left something out and I should add it into the third one, let me know. If you haven't subscribed yet, I always hope to earn that subscription. I hope you like this video, and I'll see you next time.